Baby Molly Gibson was born in October of 2020, but she was technically 27 years old at her birth, just 2 years younger than her mom. Her embryo was donated in 1992 and stored in a liquid nitrogen tank until she was adopted in 2020 for in vitro fertilization. In 1994, a Russian pilot allowed his 16-year-old son to sit at the controls of the plane. But his son accidentally disabled the autopilot, crashing the plane and killing all 75 passengers on board. From the time of its discovery to its demotion, Pluto didn't even make one full revolution around the sun. If you hit someone with your car in China, you must pay for their medical care for the rest of their life. But if you kill someone with your car, you only have to pay a one-time fee. For this reason, it's common for people to go back and kill someone they accidentally hit.
The Curious Case of Molly Gibson.
In a 1974 art performance, Marina Abramovich told visitors she wouldn't move for 6 hours no matter what they did to her. She placed 72 items on a table and invited people to use them on her however they pleased with no punishment. There were objects for pleasure including a rose, perfume and wine, as well as objects for pain including scissors, a whip, and a loaded gun. Visitors were gentle to begin with but gradually got more aggressive as they became comfortable. Within 3 hours, all of her clothes had been completely cut off and some people even started slicing her skin. She was sexually assaulted various times and had rose thorns stuck in her abdomen. One person even held the gun to her head until someone else took it away. Afterwards, Abramovich said, "If you leave it up to the audience, they can kill you."
They definitely can kill you. But how stupid can you be to standing still while they were torturing you?
Born in 1661, Charles II of Spain was the result of 200 years of inbreeding that intended to strengthen the family line. He was breastfed until the age of 4 and never fully learned how to walk. As an adult, he was completely illiterate and could barely chew or speak due to his deformed jaw. He was so ugly and disfigured that his own wife was terrified of him. In 2010, a Canadian man rescued a newborn baby from a dumpster only to find out that he was the father. In isolation wards where patients die alone, nurses fill gloves with warm water to simulate the touch of their loved ones. They call it the hand of God. In 1990, British Airways Flight 5390 experienced a window failure in the cockpit, causing the captain to be sucked out. But the crew held on to him for 20 minutes and he miraculously survived despite some frostbite and a few fractures.
If you're a true UFC fan, it would ring some bells.
Shortly after going missing for 6 days, Edgar Allan Poe died a mysterious death. When he was found, he was wearing another man's cheap clothing and couldn't explain where he'd been. Acting delirious and distressed, he was brought to the hospital where he died of unknown causes at the age of 40. Bella and Edward's relationship throughout the Twilight series meets all 15 official criteria for an abusive relationship. Up until the 1800s, Turkish women who were accused of cheating on their husbands were tied up in a sack filled with cats, then thrown in the ocean. In 2002, a 15-year-old boy became inspired by the terrorist attacks on 9/11. He decided to steal an airplane and fly it into a building in Tampa, Florida. It ended up damaging only one office room and he was the only person that died.
Wow, so Edward and Bella were in an abusive relationship all this time.
To unlock the secrets of a genius, the man who performed Einstein's autopsy stole his brain and kept it in a jar for 20 years. He found that the part of Einstein's brain that processes math and language was 15% bigger than the average human's. Throughout history, a total of 9 nuclear submarines have been lost around the world. Most of them are still on the ocean floor with nuclear weapons that are still intact. A 17-year-old boy from Mexico City died after his girlfriend gave him a hickey. The suction created a blood clot that traveled to his brain, eventually causing a stroke. When the Soviet Union was pushing toward Berlin during World War II, a Nazi SS soldier was forced to play piano for his captors. They made it clear to him in sign language that he would be executed the moment he stopped playing. He played for 22 straight hours, after which he collapsed in tears. They congratulated him, then shot him. On Halloween in 1974, Ronald O'Brien laced his 8-year-old son's pixie sticks with cyanide so that he could claim the boy's life insurance. He also gave the candy to 4 other kids to set up the story that a local madman had poisoned them. Once police received word of the first boy's death, 3 of the 4 remaining candies were recovered quickly, but 1 was still out there. When the parents of this final child were informed by police, they became hysterical when they couldn't find the pixie stick in their son's bag. So they rushed upstairs to find the boy in his bed with the poisoned candy in his hand. He had thankfully been unable to open the wrapper because of the staple that was used to reseal it. So Timothy O'Brien ended up being the only confirmed case of a kid dying from poisoned Halloween candy, and it was done by his own father.
All this just for some worthless life insurance.
After a failed circumcision led to a sex reassignment surgery, David Reimer was raised as a girl. Once he found out that he was in fact not a girl, Reimer started living as a male at the age of 15. Many shelters won't allow black cats to be adopted around Halloween time, out of fear that they might be tortured or sacrificed. In many cities across the US, people on the sex offender registry have to keep their outdoor lights off during Halloween. This is a 1948 photo of a Chicago mother hiding her face in shame after putting her children up for sale. 2 of them were sold to an abusive family for $2 apiece so that their mother could afford rent. Their new father would often tie them up in a barn and force them to work long hours, often referring to them as slaves. If you were to swim near a pod of narwhals and happen to hear one whistle, it might be the last thing that you ever hear. The sounds that narwhals make are so loud that they're said to be deafening to humans. In 2006, a 38-year-old woman who had been missing for 3 years was found dead in her London home with the TV still running. Cats have contributed to the extinction of at least 63 global vertebrate species. They're often considered to be one of the most environmentally damaging invasive predators on the planet. In 2018, a woman who received a lung transplant went into anaphylactic shock after eating peanuts even though she'd never been allergic before. She later discovered that the boy who gave her the lungs had a peanut allergy and actually died from anaphylactic shock himself. In 1912, President Teddy Roosevelt was shot in the chest just before giving a speech. Upon noticing the bullet missed his lungs, he carried on despite the blood seeping from his shirt. He delivered the full 90-minute speech before accepting medical attention. The first bomb dropped by the Allies during World War II killed the only elephant in the Berlin Zoo. Alfonso Flores from Texas received a major cosmetic surgery to increase his height from 5'11" to 6'1". He claimed it allowed him to finally achieve his dream of becoming tall. In 2009, Larry Maria Moncada from Iowa disappeared after working his shift at the supermarket. He was missing for more than a decade until his body was found when the supermarket was renovated. The man had fallen into a small gap between the wall and cooler, likely dying from dehydration after a few days of being stuck.
So all this time they didn't realize there was a body in their building.
Brooke Greenberg was an American woman with an unknown condition called Syndrome X that prevented her from aging. She was 20 years old at the time of her death, but never developed physically or mentally past the age of 1. To make a sword from the blood of your enemies, you would have to kill over 300 people to get enough iron. The U.S. military sends many of its doctors to Chicago to give them practice on gunshot wounds. During World War II, the Soviets tried to train dogs to run under enemy tanks with bombs strapped to their backs. However, this plan fortunately ended up backfiring for the Soviets. Because the dogs had been trained using Soviet tanks, many dogs ended up running to them during actual combat, blowing up friendly tanks instead. In 1987, Kenneth Parks drove 12 miles to his mother-in-law's house and stabbed her to death in the middle of the night. But he didn't receive any jail time because Parks' lawyer was able to prove that he was sleepwalking the entire time. The bolt at the top of a helicopter shaft that holds it all together is called the Jesus nut. It got its name because if it fails in flight, the only thing left to do is to pray to Jesus. Viking warriors who were badly wounded were given onion soup to test whether or not they would survive. Someone would smell the wounds after a few minutes, and if onions were detected, it meant that death was imminent. Pedro Lopez is a Colombian serial killer who was sentenced in 1980 after murdering more than 300 young girls. But after serving 18 years in Ecuadorian prison, he was released on good behavior in 1998, and his current whereabouts are unknown.
So you killed 300 people, then you served just 18 years, and then you're released because of your good behavior. Spectacular justice system.
In 1997, Bill Cosby's son Ennis was killed in a failed robbery attempt while he was changing a tire. Cosby was working toward his doctorate in special education and planned on building a school for children with disabilities. In 1971, a thief broke into a home and was shot in the legs by a trap set by the homeowner. The thief then sued the homeowner for damages and won. In 1999, a 26-year-old Polish man murdered his father with a screwdriver before making a mask out of his face. He then put on the mask along with his father's clothes and had his grandfather over for breakfast. Due to his poor hearing and eyesight, the old man swore he was talking to his son the entire time. The crime was only discovered when the grandfather found his son's body and called police. The killer was deemed clinically insane after claiming that the murder was an artistic work.
So the next time If you shoot a home invader, that's totally fine. But if you set up traps, then you're gonna get sued.
This is the last known photo of Freddie Mercury before his death in 1991. In order to avoid the attention, Freddie denied rumors about having AIDS until the day before he died. During the Middle Ages, it was believed that sperm produced from the left testicle resulted in having a girl. So to ensure having a son, men would often have their left testicle removed in a painful surgery. In the 1960s, Canadian woodsman Francis Wharton shot a deer and made dentures out of its teeth. He then proceeded to eat the deer with the deer's own teeth. A cat named Oscar correctly predicted the deaths of over 50 patients at a nursing home in Rhode Island. Soon after he arrived at the home, staff noticed that Oscar chose to nap next to patients who would die a few hours later. Nurses would sometimes even place Oscar next to patients they thought would die, but he would move to other patients and be correct every time. In 2018, Sarah and Jennifer Hart drove a van carrying their 6 adopted children off a cliff. The racist couple were abusive to their children for years. They only decided to end it all when they felt authorities closing in on their crimes. North Korean founder Kim Il-sung had a baseball-sized tumor on the back of his head that propaganda officials worked hard to hide. As a result, this is one of the only photos ever taken of the tumor. This disturbing drawing was created by a nonverbal dementia patient in a nursing home. A hitchhiking robot that relied on the kindness of strangers to travel the world made it safely across Canada, Germany, and the Netherlands. But just 2 weeks into its American tour, Hitchbot was found in Philadelphia with its arms and head ripped off.
He never made it out of Philadelphia.
An 18-year-old girl from Alaska was encouraged to murder her best friend by a boy she met online who claimed to be a multimillionaire. She then convinced 4 others to help her so that they could split a $9 million prize. It ended up being a total scam perpetrated by a mentally disabled man from Indiana. The assassin bug wears the corpses of its prey like a backpack. After stabbing its prey and slurping out the innards, the insect uses the corpses as armor and camouflage. In 1991, Patricia Stallings was sentenced to life in prison for poisoning her child with antifreeze. She then gave birth to a second child while in prison, who was given to a foster care. But he eventually became sick with the same symptoms as the first child, indicating a rare metabolic disorder, not poisoning. This proved her innocence and she was released. When Mary Ann Bevan was 32 years old, she was a beautiful nurse who was happily married with 4 children. But all of that changed in 1906 when she began suffering from acromegaly, a disease that doctors couldn't quite understand at the time. Mary was experiencing migraines and joint pain that turned into abnormal facial growth and distortion. Within 5 years, she looked like a completely different person and saw her beauty continue to fade with each day. Due to her ugliness, she was eventually fired from her job, and in 1914, her husband Thomas died from a stroke, leaving Anne and the 4 children behind. Desperate to feed her kids, Anne decided to enter a contest and won the offensive title of Ugliest Woman in the World. She was offered a job at Dreamland Circus in Coney Island, where she endured daily ridicule for 13 years until her death in 1933.
And that is exactly how villains are made.
In 2017, a Utah woman was murdered by her husband while on a murder mystery-themed cruise in Alaska. Many of the passengers thought that the screams coming from their cabin were all just part of the show. Within 3 days of dying, the bacteria in your stomach that digested your food will begin to digest you. Sent to a German mental hospital in 1907, Katerina Drexel made a husband doll out of straw. It's said that she brought the doll everywhere she went, interacting with it as if it were a living person. In 2015, a Scottish farmer reported seeing a car crash on the side of a highway. It took police 3 days to respond, and by the time they did, they found Lamara Bell in critical condition next to her dead partner. She would succumb to her injuries 4 days later due to the negligence. The details revealed in Michael Jackson's autopsy report were nothing short of disturbing. He was almost completely bald and had a number of cosmetic tattoos, including permanent eyeliner and lip liner. He had puncture wounds all over his arms and had nothing but pills in his stomach at the time of death. Michael had also undergone at least 10 nose jobs, leaving him with a left nostril that was almost completely collapsed. In 1963, the Bronx Zoo had an exhibit called The Most Dangerous Animal in the World. The entire exhibit was just a mirror. Serial killer Richard Chase once attempted to enter a woman's home but walked away after realizing her doors were locked. Chase later told detectives that he took locked doors as a sign that he wasn't welcome, but that unlocked doors were an invitation to come inside.
So basically, the most dangerous animal is in fact a human.
A man named Martin Pistorius once endured a 12-year coma even though he was completely aware of his surroundings. He He could see and hear everything, including his mother saying she hoped he would die. But he couldn't show any signs of consciousness and was completely trapped with nothing but his thoughts. In 1965, a machine was patented to deliver a baby using centrifugal force. The machine would spin the woman until the baby came out, and he or she would be caught in a net. In Switzerland, public restrooms are lit with blue lights so that junkies can't find their veins. This is an example of an underground dungeon called an oubliette in Warwick Castle. Prisoners were often dumped in these extremely narrow passages and forgotten about until they starved to death. Many of these dungeons were also placed under privies, meaning the prisoner would be the recipient of all the human waste in the castle.
Blue light to tackle junkies. That is actually genius.
A 42-year-old British woman received over $70,000 in donations after setting up a GoFundMe to fund her cancer treatment. But it turned out she was a total fraud and was instead using the money to fund her lavish lifestyle and gambling addiction. When Disney released Princess and the Frog, it caused a minor salmonella outbreak across the country. Over 50 kids were hospitalized after kissing a frog. The heaviest human ever recorded weighed 1,400 pounds at his peak. He once lost over 900 pounds only to gain it all back later in life. In the original Little Mermaid, the mermaid's feet constantly feel like she's walking on sharp knives. But the prince enjoys watching her dance, so she continues dancing for hours despite the excruciating pain. The prince then goes on to marry someone else. Donda West was turned down by many plastic surgeons before she found one who would perform on her despite her heart condition. Sadly, as a result of the surgery, she died the next day, and Kanye has blamed himself ever since. The last French soldier to die in World War I was killed just 15 minutes before the ceasefire. He was trying to deliver a message to his unit that soup would be served for lunch. A man from Turkey locked his head in a cage for weeks in an attempt to quit smoking. His wife held on to the key and only opened it for meals and sleep. In 2014, General Motors recalled 2.5 million cars for faulty ignitions. The cars would literally shut off while being driven, so drivers would lose control of their brakes and airbags wouldn't deploy. GM knew about the problem since 2005, but never fixed it because it would be too expensive. And as a result, over 100 people died.
Well, that is one of ways to quit smoking.
Contrary to what was reported at the time, Ronald Reagan lost more than half his blood and came within seconds of dying when he was shot in 1981. His true condition was concealed from the public for nearly 30 years. In an average lifetime, human skin completely replaces itself more than 900 times. A Russian woman named Kristina Ozturk is addicted to having kids and vows to have over 100 by the time she turns 30. She's only 23 years old and already has 11 kids with her 56-year-old husband. In 1967, Soviet cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov became the first person to die in space. His craft had over 200 known flaws, but his attempts to delay the flight were rejected. Had he refused the mission, his friend Yuri Gagarin would have been sent instead. Vladimir specifically asked the authorities to give him an open casket funeral after the mission. In the famous first edition of Playboy, Hugh Hefner published nude photos of Marilyn Monroe without her permission. He later purchased the crypt beside her even though they'd never met in life, and now he's buried next to her. The Great Smog of London in 1952 was so bad that pedestrians couldn't even see their shoes. It resulted in the deaths of 4,000 people, many of whom fell into the Thames River and drowned simply because they couldn't see it. In 1998, Tom and Eileen Lonergan were left behind during a diving trip in the Great Barrier Reef. It took 2 days for anyone to even notice before an extensive search was launched. 6 months later, their closing gear washed up along with a dive slate that read, "Please rescue us before we die." Their ultimate cause of death remains unknown since their bodies were never recovered.
I mean, they could have saved so much lives by placing a sign on the bridge.
As part of a fundraising publicity stunt in 1986, United Way released 1.5 million balloons in Cleveland, Ohio. But the event resulted in utter disaster since the balloons clogged various waterways and even shut down an airport. They also interrupted a Coast Guard search for 2 missing boaters who were later found to have drowned. As a sign of mourning, ancient Egyptians would often shave their eyebrows when their cats died. David Gaines earned 5 bachelor degrees at the same time at the University of Connecticut, but he sadly drowned and died just a few months after graduating because he never learned how to swim. If you ever have a kidney stone, just take a ride on Thunder Mountain in Disney World. After hearing rumors, a Michigan urologist took kidney models filled with stones on the ride. He found that the stones were passed up to 70% of the time depending on where he sat.
And that is why You don't just need educational skills, but survival skills as well.